Perhaps you remember me, the man in black. I'm here tonight to give you a friendly warning. Do you feel frightened of the dark? Squeamish about blood? Do you, who live alone, sometimes feel that your hairbrush is not quite where you left it on your dressing table? If you do, I would strongly advise you, as a friend, to avoid this channel for the next few weeks. You never know what might be looking over your shoulder.
Welcome to episode 35 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and as this episode is released on the 1st of February, this week we are discussing two films which use the month as the basis for their narratives of isolation, Satanism, and the occult. First up, we have City of the Dead from 1960 and director John Moxey. This was released in the US under the rather more sensationalist title of Horror Hotel and stars Christopher Lee, Patricia Jessel, Valentine Dyall, and Venetia Stevenson. Then we jump forward to 2015 for The Blackcoat's Daughter, which was originally released in some regions under the much more appropriate title of February. This was written and directed by Osgood Perkins and stars Emma Roberts, Keenan Shipka, Lucy Boynton, and James Remar. Along the way, we'll be discussing the meaning of Candlemas Eve, British actor Valentine Dyall, the career of director Osgood Perkins, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, just a heads up that, as well as the two movies we're talking about this week, I will also be spoiling the plot of Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 classic Psycho multiple times throughout this episode, and also, to some extent, the novel and film Rosemary's Baby. So, if you haven't seen these movies, this might not be the episode for you. And to be honest, if you haven't seen these films, I would highly recommend pressing pause, going and watching before you do anything else really, as you are really missing out. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing City of the Dead, I have referred to issue 20 of Little Shoppe of Horrors magazine. I've also referenced commentaries and special features on the Blu-ray restoration release from Arrow Video, and also the books English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema 1897 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby, and Dark Romance, Sex and Death in the Horror Film by David J. Hogan. And when discussing The Blackcoat's Daughter, I have referenced multiple online interviews, including Nylon.com, Vice.com, CinemaStrikesBack.com, HorrorNews.net, RueMorgue.com, ScreamHorrorMag.com, RogerEbert.com, and AmericanaUK.com. I've also referred to multiple video interviews that can be found on YouTube, all of which will be linked in the show notes. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is City of the Dead from 1960, and which, as I mentioned at the top of the show, was released in the US in a slightly truncated form as Horror Hotel. This was directed by John Moxey and stars Christopher Lee, Patricia Jessel, Valentine Dyall, and Venetia Stevenson. Although this film was released by Vulcan Productions, City of the Dead can very much be seen as an initial release from Amicus Productions, the studio that, throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, became famous for its anthology movies, including Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Tales from the Crypt, and From Beyond the Grave. We covered the studio and the history of Amicus back in episode 29, so I won't cover old ground here, but it's certainly worth noting that it was with City of the Dead that the studio's founders, Milton Subotsky and Max Rosenberg, first dipped their toes into the horror genre before formally founding the company with which they are more commonly associated just 1 year later. That said, though, they had almost entered the horror genre a few years earlier, when Subotsky, who up to that point had been making youth-orientated rock musicals, had the idea of creating a new film based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. At the time, this hadn't been attempted since the Universal horror franchise of the 1930s, and his big idea was to make the first Frankenstein movie shot in colour. So with this in mind, he wrote a screenplay that he claimed was very faithful to Shelley's novel, though his business partner, Max Rosenberg, would later say that, quote, "It wasn't a very good script because, frankly, Milton wasn't a very good writer." End quote. They took the screenplay to the head of a production company called Associated Artists Productions, which would go on to become Seven Arts Films. They questioned what somebody with a background in musicals would know about horror films, but they did offer to send it on to a friend of theirs, James Carreras, the head of the Hammer studio. Carreras purchased the script and had it completely rewritten, at which point it became Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein. And, as you probably know by now, the success of Curse of Frankenstein directly led to the Hammer horror boom of the late 1950s and the 1960s. Whether Subotsky and Rosenberg were responsible for this boom in horror is very much open to debate. Carreras' son, Michael, certainly disagreed, later saying, quote, "I'm fairly certain that Mr. Subotsky had nothing to do with it, but if he wants to take the credit, I'm perfectly happy to let him." End quote. It's also likely that, given the success of Hammer's The Quatermass experiment in 1953, the studio's trajectory would have taken them into horror regardless. Still, it's an intriguing anecdote, and one that would be picked up by writer David Pirrie in his book A Heritage of Horror, where he writes, quote, "Hammer kept a tight lid on Subotsky's early involvement in Frankenstein for a long time, ensuring that very few people knew they were indirectly responsible for the whole British horror boom. Indeed, I once heard Michael Carreras refusing to endorse the notion when asked by a journalist." End quote. As we all know, there are, of course, 3 sides to every story. In this case, Subotsky's, Hammer's, and the actual truth probably lying somewhere in between. Regardless, Subotsky appears to have been less than impressed with the finished film, later describing Hammer's version as both cheap and violent, though he did concede it had a brilliant advertising campaign and also acknowledged its huge success. And I'd just like to say that for all of that information, I am very much indebted to the always brilliantly researched publication Little Shoppe of Horrors. This story is detailed in issue 20, which covers the history of Amicus films, and issue 21, which focuses on the making of The Curse of Frankenstein. So if you'd like to find out more, both issues are available to purchase online in a downloadable format. So City of the Dead, then, is Subotsky and Rosenberg's first actual horror production, and was initially written for a Boris Karloff TV series, which never came to pass. Based on a short story by Subotsky called Witchcraft, the script was written by George Baxt, an American novelist and screenwriter who moved to the UK in the 1950s. As well as this film, Baxt wrote the screenplay for a handful of horror movies, including Circus of Horrors in 1960 and 1961's Shadow of the Cat, and he was also employed for rewrites on the screenplay for 1962's Night of the Eagle, which we covered back in episode 8. However, he is best remembered as the creator of a gay black police detective called Pharaoh Love, who appeared in a series of novels, beginning with the title A Queer Kind of Death, which was published in 1966. As you can imagine, this was a groundbreaking idea for the time, and the character went on to appear in a series of books, including Swing Low, Sweet Harriet, published in 1967, Topsy and Evil, published in 1968, A Queer Kind of Love, published in 1994, and the rather uniquely titled A Queer Kind of Umbrella, presumably it's a rainbow one, which was published in 1995. In total, Baxt wrote 26 crime fiction novels, and he was also nominated for an Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America. This was for his 1968 novel, A Parade of Cockeyed Creatures, but he was also a multi-award nominee at the Lambda Literary Awards for Mystery. Because the original screenplay was intended for television, it was only an hour long, and so it was extended by Milton Subotsky himself, who increased the running time from 60 minutes to 78. By all accounts, Baxt and Subotsky did not really get along. Max Rosenberg, who was in the US at the time, later remembered receiving numerous phone calls from both of them, each complaining about the other, though he also remembered liking Baxt very much, and added that, quote, "This was the first time that I found out that Milton Subotsky could be difficult," end quote. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so if you haven't seen City of the Dead yet, it's time to continue with caution. And indeed, if you haven't seen the film yet, and do plan to do so, please do ensure you watch the UK version, City of the Dead, rather than the US shorter Horror Hotel. The film opens in the 17th century town of Whitewood in New England with the execution by fire of Elizabeth Selwyn, a woman accused of being in league with the devil. And, as it turns out, the townsfolk, all Puritan hats and buckled shoes, are very correct in their assumptions. Elizabeth Selwyn is indeed a witch, and she curses the town and its descendants as the flames around her grow higher. She also manages to implicate her lover, a man called Jethro Keane, who denies all knowledge, but who secretly prays to Lucifer to save her from the fire. This opening has often been compared to the beginning of Black Sunday, the Italian movie from 1960, which marked the debut of director Mario Bava, and which also introduced horror audiences to the queen of Italian Gothic horror, Barbara Steele. And it's quite easy to understand the comparisons. Not only do both films begin with a witch being executed, they are also both shot in a highly stylized, some might say even expressionistic, style, transforming their studio-bound sets and limited budgets through remarkable cinematography and eye-catching art direction. The cinematography, in this case, comes courtesy of Desmond Dickinson, a veteran of British cinema since the 1920s, and who also directed the first British talkie serial, Detective Lloyd, in 1932. During the Second World War, he made morale-boosting documentaries, and then returned to the big screen as a cinematographer for, among others, the Laurence Olivier version of Hamlet, released in 1948, The Importance of Being Earnest, released in 1952, and the hugely entertaining The Horrors of the Black Museum, which was released in 1959. Filmed in high contrast, black and white, the opening shot of the movie is masterful, with a low-angle perspective of a burning brazier in the foreground, as the Puritans stride through the swirling fog towards the camera, calling for Elizabeth Selwyn to be executed. The execution also includes what I can only assume to be a fragment of reverse motion footage, played as Elizabeth struggles against her ropes, and which momentarily achieves the same disorientating effect used by David Lynch in the Red Rooms of Twin Peaks. From here, we flash forward to the classroom of Professor Alan Driscoll, played by Christopher Lee, who here affects a reasonably passable American accent. We realise that this opening has been a representation of a lecture recounting the story of Selwyn's death to his class of history students. One of them, Nan Barlow, who is played by Venetia Stevenson, decides that witchcraft will be the basis of her thesis and travels to the town of Whitewood for research, opting to stay, at Driscoll's recommendation, at a hotel called the Ravens Inn. En route, she encounters a man standing in the fog by the roadside, and he offers to direct her to Whitewood in exchange for a ride. The eagle-eyed among the audience will recognise this as Jethro Keane, the man who, at one and the same time, denounced Elizabeth Selwyn while praying to Satan for her salvation. Keane is played by Valentine Dyall, an actor blessed with a very distinctive low vocal tone that has been described as mellifluous, and who, quite honestly, makes Vincent Price sound quite average by comparison. Born in 1908, he was the son of stage actor Franklin Dyall and Mary Logan, who acted and wrote novels under the rather brilliant pseudonym of Concordia Merrill. Dyall began his career on stage in 1934, before moving into film work, but he rose to fame as the narrator of the 1940s BBC radio series Appointment with Fear. In this series, he hosted as the Man in Black, introducing stories by Edgar Allan Poe and M.R. James, among others. My mother once told me that when she was a child, his voice used to scare her so much that she would run from the room whenever the show was aired. But very sadly, only 4 of the episodes have survived. All of these can be found on YouTube, and I'll link them in the show notes, so you can judge Dyall's voice for yourself. The success of the radio show led to a film adaptation, The Man in Black, released in 1950 by Hammer Studios, with Dyall very briefly reprising his role as the host. Unfortunately, aside from his characteristic introduction, the actual film itself really isn't much to write home about. And while it does feature Sid James, later of Carry On movie fame, as a yoga expert, even this really isn't enough for me to recommend it. Valentine Dyall had already worked with Hammer 1 year previously, with the movie Dr. Morell, which was released in 1949. Both of these films were made before Hammer entered their horror period, and for a very brief moment, it looked as if Dyall might continue the relationship, but sadly, this was not to be. A disagreement about money led to a falling out with the studio, and so we can now only imagine what the actor would have brought to their horror pictures had this not been the case. He did, however, still occasionally appear in genre productions. As well as this, he has a minor role as the groundskeeper Mr. Dudley in the Robert Wise 1963 movie The Haunting, and he also provided the voice of God in the 1967 comedy Bedazzled, which starred Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. His career continued largely on stage and television, including the classic 1970s BBC drama Secret Army, the BBC adaptation of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, and the comedy series Blackadder. However, his most memorable later role is probably as Doctor Who's adversary, the Black Guardian. This was a recurring guest role that made excellent use of his menacing presence, but which also required him to wear a dead crow on his head. It's fair to say that not everybody can get away with a dead bird headdress, but somehow Valentine Dyall manages to carry it off. The Black Guardian would in fact be one of his final roles, and he died, aged 77, at his home in Sussex, England, in 1985. Arriving in Whitewood, which is still shrouded in fog, Nan checks into the Ravens Inn and meets the landlady, Mrs. Newlis, who we recognise as Elizabeth Selwyn. As it turns out, she is not dead after all, and also, it would appear, is rather fond of an anagram, phonetically, if not literally. This is something that we would also see a few years later in Rosemary's Baby, and given that in many magical practices, names are thought to hold power, it's probably no surprise that the witches choose to retain them. As the magazine Little Shoppe of Horrors quite rightly points out, at least it's more subtle than the Alucard anagram of Dracula from movies like 1943's Son of Dracula or Hammer's Dracula AD 1972. Mrs. Newlys is played by English actress Patricia Jessel, who was blessed with a bone structure that Barbara Steele herself would envy. Stealing the movie from the rest of the cast, including Christopher Lee, her first appearance as Elizabeth Selwyn is quite remarkable in its ferocity, matched only by her tight-lipped formality in her dual identity as Mrs. Newlys, a veneer of civility that barely disguises her malicious intent underneath. As Nan checks into her room and wanders through the foggy streets of Whitewood, we begin to suspect, if we hadn't already, that she might be in more than a little danger. This is signposted not just by the menace of Mrs. Newlys and Jethro Keane, but also by the incredibly sinister townsfolk who stop in the back of the frame to stare at her as she passes by. We also soon discover that the date is the 1st of February, or Candlemas Eve, and are told that this date is of particular significance in witchcraft and devil worship. Quote, "On Candlemas Eve, February the 1st, in the year 1692, a coven of witches whose power came from the devil gathered beneath the Raven's Inn to perform a black mass in the honour of Lucifer. The witch, Elizabeth Selwyn, later to be burned at the stake, marked a young girl for sacrifice by obtaining an object of value belonging to her and with which to call her, and leaving in its place a dead bird and a sprig of woodbine. The witches sacrificed her on the altar and drank her blood at the hour of 13. End quote. Candlemas, or February the 2nd, is a date in the Christian Church that is alternately known as the Feast of the Presentation of Christ in the Temple and the Purification of the Blessed Virgin. The festival marks the light of Christ in the world, and many churches bless candles to mark the occasion, which are then taken home and burned across the year to offer spiritual comfort and also protection. It therefore makes sense, in the world of the movie, that the witches would see the eve of this festival as being of special significance, celebrating darkness and their master Lucifer, before goodness and purity are in their turn celebrated in the wider world. However, February 1st also has other spiritual significance in the real world, though not, I hasten to add, in any way related to the fictional events that occur here. February 1st is also Imbolc, a Celtic festival which marks the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, symbolising the beginning of spring and a time of renewal. It's also associated with the Irish Saint Brigid, and traditions include the making of Brigid's crosses from rushes, which are then hung over doors and windows to welcome the saint and also to ward away evil. Other practices include cleansing and purifying the home, planting seeds, and also the lighting of candles. And it's a festival that is still celebrated by thousands of people the world over. Although we suspect that Nan may be in danger, most first-time viewers do not anticipate what happens to her once she returns to her room at the inn. Ironically, rather patronisingly, she first tells Mrs. Newlys the history of Candlemas Eve, leading in with the introduction, quote, "I bet you don't know the half of it, and you live right here, on the spot where the witches were actually burned." She then attempts to join the other guests, who are dancing in the main room, only to find that they have suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. Finding a hidden key to unlock the cellar, she ventures beneath her room, only to suddenly be dragged to a sacrificial altar and dispatched at the hands of Mrs. Newlis as the clock strikes 13, while Professor Alan Driscoll, himself a member of the coven, watches from the shadows. This turn of events is highly unexpected, as Nan has been, until this point, the central character of the movie, and so her death at the midway mark comes as a surprise, to say the least. This has inevitably drawn comparisons with Hitchcock's Psycho, which was also released in 1960, and when City of the Dead was released as Horror Hotel in the States 1 year later, many claimed that it was simply a pale imitation. But given that the UK production began filming nearly 2 months before Janet Leigh took an early shower, these comments are both inaccurate and unfair. That being said, though, it has been suggested that Milton Subotsky would have been more than familiar with Robert Bloch's novel on which the Hitchcock movie was based, and so probably took some inspiration as he expanded on Bach's original screenplay. And if we're being honest, the twist belongs to neither City of the Dead or Alfred Hitchcock, but instead to writer Robert Bloch, the author of the novel Psycho, on which Hitchcock based his movie. He said, quote, "So I devised a heroine from another town who had come to stay at this particular motel on a mission. It occurred to me to do something not generally done in fiction. Establish a heroine, give her a problem, make her more or less likable so that the reader would have some kind of empathy for her, and then kill her off." End quote. But regardless of the origins of this plot device, both films certainly mark a turning point for the genre, moving it away from the rather conventional structures which had gone before and into far more paranoid terrain where anything is possible and no character is truly safe. While this was certainly revolutionary in the 1960s, in my opinion, it's a ploy that is probably overplayed a little too much these days. And yes, I'm talking about later seasons of Game of Thrones. But sadly, much as in Psycho, once our heroine is dispensed with, our attention is directed to some far less interesting protagonists. And whilst Hitchcock could fall back on the talents of Vera Miles and Martin Balsam and the chiselled good looks of John Gavin, director John Moxey had a little less to play with. At this point then, we leave the foggy streets of Whitewood and return to the cold and rather dull reality of university life. Instead of our spirited heroine, Nan, we are now in the company of her far less likeable boyfriend Bill, played by Tom Naylor, and her brother Richard, played by Dennis Loftus. Loftus was a South African-born singer and had established quite a following in the UK thanks to his recording career and various guest appearances on TV music shows. Presumably cast to appeal to a wider and female demographic, his performance is rather stilted, and at times it's rather hard to believe that he is in any way actually worried for his sister, seeming more irritated by her disappearance than he is anything else. Tom Naylor, as Nan's college boyfriend, is similarly out of place, though this impression may be down as much to the boorish nature of his underdeveloped character as it is to his actual performance. Strangely, the cynical boyfriend in a witchcraft movie seems to have been something of a trope of the genre at the time, with a nearly interchangeable character appearing in Night of the Eagle just 2 years later. Our replacement heroine is the minister's daughter, Patricia Russell, and she is played by Betta St. John, an American former child star. St. John is perfectly fine in the role, but in my opinion, her part is rather underwritten, particularly when compared to the spirited and intrepid character of Nan, who we followed closely in the first half of the film. And so personally, my biggest critique of the film is that while the shock twist works brilliantly, the death of Nan Barlow leaves the rest of the movie with very few characters that I can really get behind. Fortunately, we are more than compensated with the excellent direction, atmosphere, and striking imagery once we return to Whitewood. And for this, we have to give thanks to Desmond Dickinson and director John Moxey, here making his feature debut. Having cut his teeth on television and army education movies, Moxey's eye for composition caught the attention of co-producer Donald Taylor, who offered him the opportunity to direct. He may not, by his own admission, have had any input into the script, but the atmosphere is certainly his. The imagery that he creates with Dickinson is what elevates the movie far beyond its £45,000 budget, which would be worth just over £1 million today. As well as the opening and the sheer creepiness of the townspeople staring after Nan as she wanders by, we also have the stunning shot of Jethro Keane standing motionless by the side of the road, visible only as a silhouette in the fog, a moment which anticipates a similar sequence in William Friedkin's The Exorcist. There's also the scene of the coven making their way through the graveyard, the flickering firelight of the Raven's Inn, and the climax in the cemetery, with a mortally wounded Bill struggling with a giant cross in his attempt to destroy the coven. The atmosphere, along with the New England and university settings, has led to comparisons with the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and the film has often been called more Lovecraftian than many official Lovecraft movies. And it's really easy to see why. With its swirling fog, clapboard houses, and incredibly claustrophobic atmosphere, Whitewood feels as if it's adjacent to Lovecraft country, and you can easily imagine that Keziah Mason's witch house is located just off a side street. Christopher Lee himself recalled being struck by these similarities in tone when he first read the screenplay, and I have to say, it feels like a lost opportunity that Moxey was never given the chance to direct a Lovecraft adaptation himself. You can't help but wonder what might have been if he had been offered The Curse of the Crimson Altar in 1968, as opposed to the, in my opinion, far less talented Vernon Sewell. Despite its explicit themes of satanic ritual and human sacrifice, City of the Dead passed through the British Board of Film Censors with relatively few objections. As we discussed back in episode 8, historically the British censors had maintained a rigid moral code and viewed any reference to witchcraft, black magic, or Satanism as morally dangerous. And while the appointment of John Trevelyan as the head of the BBFC in 1958 certainly ushered in a slightly more liberal approach, the film's approval as one of the earliest British occult horrors is still rather surprising. On its submission in 1959, the movie was granted an X certificate, and only minor edits were requested, which largely focused around the burning at the stake at the beginning and the final moments depicting Elizabeth Selwyn's charred corpse. In the States, though, it was a different story, with Selwyn's pact with the devil trimmed quite extensively, which rather undermines the narrative. The US distributor also decided to trim some of the more atmospheric moments to speed the pace for the American market. And, as I mentioned at the top of the show, they also renamed it Horror Hotel, a move that neither John Moxey nor Christopher Lee were particularly impressed by. Even less impressive was the tagline grafted onto the posters, which suggested that viewers should ring for doom service, a terrible pun that quite honestly calls for the writers to be sacrificed at the hands of Mrs. Newless and friends. Released in the UK in 1960 and the US in 1961, City of the Dead, or Horror Hotel, opened to mixed to middling reviews in both territories. In the UK, While some recognised its atmosphere and cinematography, others felt it lacked originality. It did, however, still do rather well at the UK box office and went into profit within weeks of its release. In the States, however, critics were far more dismissive, calling it dull and unoriginal, and suggesting that it should be relegated to teenage matinee audiences. Nevertheless, the film did manage to recoup its budget, and whilst it could not be considered a runaway success, it wasn't exactly a failure either. Following City of the Dead, Subotsky and Rosenberg founded Amicus Films, creating a low-budget studio whose output is still very highly regarded today. John Moxey moved to the States, where, on the advice of a numerologist, he changed his name to John Llewellyn Moxey and continued to direct. He worked largely in television, including episodes of Hawaii Five-0, Murder, She Wrote, Miami Vice, Mission Impossible, and also the pilot episode of Charlie's Angels. But in addition to this, he also directed several horror movies for American TV. These include A Taste of Evil in 1971 and Home for the Holidays in 1972. This is a surprisingly creepy Christmas slasher that generated numerous complaints when it aired on TV for being far too frightening. And despite the obvious restrictions of its budget and its TV format, it's still a rather interesting watch. And who knows, we might even cover it for Christmas 2026. But far more significantly than those films, he also directed the Richard Matheson scripted TV movie, The Night Stalker, which aired on ABC as a movie of the week in January 1972. This stars Darren McGavin as a cynical newspaper reporter called Carl Kolchak, who begins to suspect that a serial killer in Las Vegas is in fact a vampire. It's gone on to very deservedly achieve cult status, and its success led first to a sequel in 1973 called The Night Strangler, and then a very short-lived series in 1974 called Kolchak, The Night Stalker, which many people cite as being an influence on the later series, The X-Files. Kolchak, The Night Stalker series is, if we're honest, not the best, but I do highly recommend both movies, The Night Stalker and The Night Strangler, not least for Darren McGavin's incredibly engaging performance as Carl Kolchak, but also their genuinely creepy atmosphere. There was an attempt at a revival of the Night Stalker series in 2005, which starred Stuart Townsend and Gabrielle Union, and which was, in a nice circularity, quite clearly itself inspired by The X-Files. It wasn't a great success and was cancelled after one season, but there is one episode called What's the Frequency, Kolchak that, at the time at least, I thought was highly effective. I've recently noticed that all episodes are available on YouTube, so when I get the time, I may well consider a revisit. Over time, largely due to its stunning cinematography and the shock twist in the middle, City of the Dead has gained a cult status and was remastered and reissued by Arrow Video in the UK in 2017. Despite my complaints regarding the characters in the second half of the movie, it's still a film that I often return to, particularly if I'm feeling under the weather and want to rot on the sofa under a duvet. And I know a film about Satanism and human sacrifice probably isn't everyone's choice of a comfort movie, but what can I tell you? It's certainly one of mine. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is The Blackcoat's Daughter from 2015. This was written and directed by Osgood Perkins and stars Emma Roberts, Keenan Shipka, and Lucy Boynton. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this was originally filmed and released in some regions under the title of February, until it underwent a name change at the request of distributors A24. As Perkins explained in interviews at the time of the film's release, A24 wanted a title that was more indicative of the horror genre and had suggested titles that didn't necessarily speak to him or, one assumes, the film's ambiguity and tone. And whilst he would have preferred to retain the original title, and which I have to admit I prefer also, he realised that for the film to find its audience, he needed to make whatever changes necessary. Referencing an old folk rhyme that his brother Elvis Perkins had used in the soundtrack, he decided that The Blackcoat's Daughter was as good a title as any. At the very least, it retained the ambiguity, while also suggesting that the film is about a vulnerable child who is also the daughter of some dark force. As he elaborated in a later interview, quote, "I used to think that there are 3 stages to making a movie, but really there's 4. First you write it, then you shoot it and cut it, and then you show it. Showing the movie is a totally different animal than actually creating the movie, because they're not really related anymore." End quote. Much like City of the Dead, this is a film about satanic forces, but far more than that, it's also a film about grief and the loss of self that comes as a result. The foundation for the story comes from the loss of his parents. His father was the actor Anthony Perkins, who died of pneumonia complicated by HIV in September 1992, and his mother, Barry Berenson, was a passenger on American Airlines Flight 11 when it was hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001. The loss of both parents in the same calendar month, separated by a 9-year period and almost on the exact anniversary, is an event that he explores explicitly in the film's narrative, and the outcome of the movie becomes all the more painful when this is considered, something we'll discuss a little bit later. Over the past decade, Osgood Perkins has built a considerable reputation as a director, with a series of movies that, whilst categorised as horror, are mainly, as he puts it, Trojan horse films, using the trappings of the genre to explore wider and deeper themes. These include 2016's I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, Gretel and Hansel, released in 2020, Longlegs, released in 2024, and The Monkey and Keeper, which were both released in 2025. And while his more recent films, particularly Longlegs, have gained him international attention, I have to say that of his work so far, The Blackcoat's Daughter is my favourite, a film which not only stands up to repeat viewings, but one that seems to improve every time, revealing aspects of story and character that are quite easily missed on the first viewing. Osgood Perkins was born in Manhattan in 1974 to actor, writer and director Anthony Perkins and actress, model and photographer Barry Berenson Perkins. His maternal aunt is the actress and former model Marissa Berenson, and his paternal grandfather, after whom he is named, was the stage and film actor Osgood, who we mentioned very briefly in episode 32 in relation to the folk horror movie Puritan Passions, which was released in 1923. Considering his lineage, it is perhaps not surprising that he took up a career in the creative arts, first as an actor before moving into screenwriting and directing. His film debut was at the age of 8 years old, appearing in the 1983 movie Psycho 2. This is during a flashback scene where he plays, naturally enough, the young Norman Bates, the role that made his father internationally famous and also saw him typecast for the rest of his career. After a 10-year hiatus to gain an education, Osgood went on to appear in 1993's 6 Degrees of Separation, Wolf in 1994, Legally Blonde in 2004, and the 2009 movie version of Star Trek. He also appeared in various episodes of TV programs, including the J.J. Abrams series Alias and 2008's October Road. But acting was far from being his first love, and he has said that writing and directing has been his ambition since childhood. He's also described his stint as an actor as, quote, "not something I took very seriously, not something that I was especially good at, and something I couldn't be more relieved to be done with. So, after a very unsatisfying run as a not very satisfying actor, I got back to what I wanted to be doing, which was creating worlds, writing screenplays, and directing movies." End quote. His first writing credit was as a co-writer on the 2010 horror movie Removal, in which he also appeared, and then the 2013 film Cold Comes the Night, which starred Bryan Cranston, Logan Marshall Green, and Alice Eve. The Blackcoat's Daughter, under the original title of February, was his first solo original screenplay, and also his feature directing debut. Unfortunately, due to a rather laborious post-production period, The Blackcoat's Daughter would end up being released after his second feature, I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, was released by Netflix in 2016. And now we are getting into the spoilers, and there is indeed a lot to spoil with this movie, so if you haven't seen it yet, please proceed with caution, as I am about to reveal the entire plot. The Blackcoat's Daughter tells of two schoolgirls, Catherine, or Cat, and the slightly older Rose, who are students at the Bramford Academy, an isolated Catholic boarding school in upstate New York. And incidentally, the name Bramford is quite possibly a reference to the New York apartment from Rosemary's Baby, a film that Perkins has cited as being an influence. The school has just commenced its midterm break, but while the other students are collected by their parents, both Kat and Rose are left behind. Rose, as we soon discover, suspects that she is pregnant and has deliberately misinformed her parents about the school's closing date so that she can meet with the potential father and tell him their news. However, Kat is not there of her own volition. Her parents have not turned up to collect her, and, as we learn in a very early dream sequence, or possible vision, it is highly likely that they have both been killed in a car accident on the way to collect her. Remaining in the snowbound school, the two girls are both nominally in the care of two teachers, who we presume to be nuns, Miss Drake and Miss Prescott, though the headmaster has charged Rose with looking after the younger girl while they wait for their parents to arrive. During their first night in the now abandoned boarding school, Rose teases Kat with a school legend about the nuns, that they are firstly completely hairless, a fact that is hidden by wigs, and also that they are in league with the devil. This sets up the theme of Satanism which permeates the rest of the film, though as we later discover there have been multiple clues to this theme laid out in front of us from the very beginning. But it is not the sisters that we need to be concerned about because, as the narrative progresses, it becomes all too clear that there is something very, very wrong with young Catherine. As I mentioned earlier, this is a Trojan horse of a movie, something that it shares in common with other films we have discussed in the series. Specifically, 2015's They Look Like People, which we discussed in episode 9, and 2011's The Ghoul, which we covered back in episode 11. Because while the film is nominally about demonic possession, it is in fact an exploration of grief and the vacuum that is left when one suffers a traumatic event. In Kat's case, the vacuum is filled by a demonic entity, but it could just as easily be filled by drugs, alcohol, or depression. And in fact, demonic possession is just one read of the movie, and one that, over repeated viewings, I have gradually started to lean away from. Certainly, the tropes of possession are all there, including a brief physical contortion and projectile vomiting, but they are handled with far more subtlety and nuance than those to which we have become accustomed since the release of The Exorcist in 1973. In this case, Kat's contortion may be briefly presented to us front and centre on the screen, but it's up to the viewer whether this is literal or metaphorical. The shadowy presence of the demon, revealed to us through flashback, may be a real entity, or it may be hallucination. And the same could be said for the telephone calls she receives that provide her with demonic instructions. And we've seen this device already in at least one of the films that I mentioned earlier. This is something that I think is emphasized by the fact that, a very brief introductory scene and a few flashbacks aside, we never really meet the Catherine. As multiple viewings reveal, even in the headmaster's office, she is already under the influence of something, smiling at something in the corner as she tells him that she is sad he will miss her performance. And this is a line, incidentally, that takes on an ominous duality when viewed with the benefit of hindsight. During her piano recital, playing another of Elvis Perkins' compositions, she pauses briefly to glance at two empty seats in the auditorium. We assume on first viewing that she is missing her parents, but once again, on second viewing, we may start to question this interpretation. The knowledge that the figure of the demon was inspired by Perkins' own experience of taking the hallucinogen ayahuasca also suggests that it may be a representation of internal struggle as much as it is an external force. This, of course, though, is just one reading, and certainly doesn't negate the opinions of those for whom the entity is as factual as the other events of the movie. Since the release of Longlegs in 2024, there have been many who have suggested that the use of mysterious phone calls in both films indicates a shared universe and shared demonology, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with this interpretation either. One of the reasons that I feel this film stands up to repeat viewing so well is that it can be read on many levels. A deliberate strategy on the part of Perkins, and one that, as regular listeners will know, is something I personally enjoy very much, if enjoy is indeed the right verb in this case. For Perkins himself, the interpretation is actually less important than the end result, something he explained in an interview that was published on the website rogerebert.com. Quote, "What's important is that we are watching this person go through this thing. What the thing is kind of between her and the thing. It's like trying to reach a loved one who is in the throes of a traumatic experience, a breakup, a drug addiction, a death, or something like that. There's no way into it. I've experienced the loss of people who are significant to me, but that doesn't mean that when my friend also experiences the loss of a significant person, that I have any way into it. It's a very private experience. So, whether it is the devil possessing this girl, or whether she is simply not okay anymore, all that matters is that she gets to the end of the road and has nowhere left to go. This is what I care about the most. All that matters is that we arrive at the last scene." End quote. By now, it should be apparent that the film is as much Perkins exploring his own reaction to the loss of both parents as it is about anything else. And the original title of the film has a much deeper resonance and meaning when viewed through this lens. His parents both died in the same calendar month of September, albeit separated by just under a decade. The title of February is not just the period in which the film is set, but also speaks to his belief that a time can also be a location, and that we can revisit a month just as people revisit negative anniversaries. He has said that for him, quote, "To visit the month of September is as potent as visiting a cemetery." So, from that quality of February being the location of the story, I derived the first title. End quote. And this is not the only time that he has used his work as an exploration of his own family dynamics. He's gone on to say that his follow-up, I Am the Pretty Thing Which Lives in the House, is about reconciling his inability to know his late father and about his search for a posthumous relationship. As I mentioned, the Blackcoat's daughter had a rather torturous production history, both pre- and post-filming. Whilst many studios loved his screenplay, the general feedback was that its ambiguity, tone, and non-linear structure made it impossible to film, and he has recalled that he was advised on more than one occasion to write something far more straightforward. Initially, Brian Bertino, the director of 2008's The Strangers, was interested in directing, and one can certainly see a connection between this story and much of his other work. His 2016 movie, The Monster, is as much, if not more, about parent-child relationships than it is about anything else. And The Dark and the Wicked from 2020 also has themes of grief and family trauma beneath its narrative of demonic possession. Bertino and producer Adrienne Biddle could see that this was a personal project for Perkins and encouraged him to take up the directing duties himself. Even then, financing proved a challenge. Perkins was a first-time director, not only of feature films, but in every sense of the word. There were no short films, TV work, or music videos on his resume, and backers were rather wary. Funding a first-time director with a non-linear and challenging screenplay was not exactly a logical investment. By all accounts, the journey from initial concept to production took the best part of a decade, and if backers were going to open their wallets, it would take something far more convincing than an ambiguous screenplay about the devil. And this is where Emma Roberts comes in. In addition to Kat and Rose, we soon meet a third character, an introverted, some might say near catatonic young woman travelling cross-country who says her name is Joan, though we later discover that this is an alias. Sitting in the cold at a bus station, she is offered a ride by Bill, the male partner in a travelling couple that we initially take to be Kat's delayed parents, a notion that is reinforced by the Bramford School bumper sticker shown as their car pulls into the night. But as the narrative continues, we realise we are observing two time periods, both in the month of February, but separated by a space of some years, underlining the notion that a month is as much a location as it is a division of time. Joan is in fact the adult Kat, and has escaped from an institution where we presume she has been incarcerated since the events of the other narrative thread. This is disclosed through the device of a photograph, one for which we saw Rose posing at the start of the movie, and is accompanied by a rug-pulling reveal that Rose has been dead for 9 years. This bait-and-switch tactic subverts audience expectations and also adds to the building sense of dread, a ploy once described by Alfred Hitchcock as a lesson in how to craft suspense. "We are now having a very innocent little chat," he once said. "But let's suppose that there is a bomb underneath this table between us. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, there is an explosion. The public is surprised, but prior to this surprise, it has been seen as an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now, let us take a suspense situation. The bomb is underneath the table, and the public knows it, probably because they have seen the anarchist place it there. The public is aware that the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and there is a clock in the decor. The public can see that this is 1:15. In these conditions, the same innocuous conversation becomes fascinating, because the public is participating in the scene. The audience is longing to warn the characters on the screen, you shouldn't be talking about such trivial matters. There is a bomb beneath you, and it is about to explode. In the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of explosion. In the second, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense. The conclusion, he continued, is that wherever possible, the public must be informed, except when the surprise is a twist. That is, when the unexpected ending is, in itself, the highlight of the story. This strategy is, of course, the opposite of the one adopted for Psycho, and also the one taken in City of the Dead, where the murders of Marion Crane and Nan Barlow are shocking because they seem to come from nowhere, killing off the person we believe to be the central character in the story. But this is certainly a technique that Hitchcock used many times over, with the tracking shot of a possibly poisoned glass of milk in 1941 Suspicion being a case in point. In this case, the bomb is Kat, aka Joan, and is one that Perkins has planted in both time periods. Now, the audience has to wait to see the manner of Rose's inevitable demise, and also left to wonder what might happen to her parents, Bill and Linda, whose fate for the rest of the movie hangs very much in the balance. This is masterful storytelling, and, as repeat viewings will attest, has been perfectly woven since the opening scene. Unlike some other movies, there is not a single thread that can be unpulled. The notion of a double family tragedy separated by a 9-year gap is, of course, very much an echo of Perkins' own life, and the presence of Bill and Linda also allow him to further explore the notion of grief. Bill hallucinates echoes of Rose in Perfect Strangers, and has also retreated into religion, both of which tragically become the instruments of his own demise. Proving the adage that no good deed goes unpunished, he inadvertently offers a ride to his daughter's killer, and his attempts to explain the presence of God also serve as a trigger for Joan's final acts of carnage. Quote, "Do you believe in God, Joan? Have you ever tried to look for him? It's strange. People think you look for him in some book, or a church, or a statue, even a candle flame. But that's not how it works for me. I look for him in the unlikely things that happen, little coincidences. When I saw you sitting at that bus station, you reminded me so much of someone I haven't seen in a long time. And when you said you were going to Portsmouth, well, a coincidence like that, I just can't ignore it. So, strange as it may sound, I guess I saw God in you." End quote. For Joan, though, the coincidence that she has been given a ride by Rose's parents is not proof of God, but instead proof of the devil. Her quick gasp of laughter is not, as we may first assume, at the irony of the situation, but is instead a twisted variant on magical thinking, evidence that her journey has meaning, and that Bill and Linda will act as an offering to bring the demon back to her, following her exorcism. Linda, on the other hand, is managing her grief very differently. While Bill has hope in the hereafter, she has understandably given herself over to rage. In a monologue that is quite beautifully delivered by actor Lauren Holly, she vents her frustration at his efforts to see the Rose in everybody. Quote, "He told you remind him of her. He actually said that to you, didn't he? It's okay. Poor thing. He tries to say that to everyone. Of course, I never see it. Of course, it isn't true. But still sometimes I try." End quote. She goes on to say that she saw it once in a young girl when she was alone, before making the very perceptive observation of Joan, quote, "It's strange. I can't see you at all." End quote. This highlights the idea that Joan/Kat has been an empty vessel since the death of her parents, and that without the presence of the demon, she hardly exists at all. Needing an actor with a following to draw in an audience and thus help with financing, Perkins thought of Emma Roberts, who had by this time appeared in the fourth film in the Scream franchise and was then filming American Horror Story Coven in New Orleans. Reading the screenplay in one sitting, Roberts has compared its combination of beauty and horror to a novel, and has also commented on the physical and emotional impact that it had on her, saying that after reading it, she woke up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m. This led to the realization that if she could put the script down and get on with her day, and then still wake up out of a deep sleep terrified, there was something very special about the story. These initial instincts were further confirmed following a telephone call with Perkins, after which she signed up for the film. Having her attached to the project made the process of financing a little bit smoother than it had been, and it also led to the casting of Keenan Shipka, as it was Emma Roberts who suggested her for the part, commenting on the young actress's maturity and saying, quote, "It would be so good to see her introduced to this weird world," end quote. The pairing couldn't have been more perfect. Not only is there a striking physical resemblance between the two, in the movie at least, but both give highly committed performances that are genuinely disturbing and also, on Robert's part at least, largely silent. These are extremely physical portrayals, delivered through nuance and micro-expression, and both are genuinely terrifying, while also retaining a deep humanity and tragedy, particularly in the climactic scenes of the film. Keenan Shipka, who was only about 15 years old when the movie began filming, had just finished an 8-year run as the character Sally Draper on the AMC series Mad Men, and was, by her own admission, a little uncertain of the direction she should take after such a long run on a highly successful TV show. Like Emma Roberts, she was immediately attracted to the story and the character, later saying that when she read the script, she immediately knew it was going to be good. Also like Roberts, it was a conversation with Perkins that sealed the deal, saying that she knew automatically that he had good taste, and also, very importantly, that she was going to be in safe hands. Knowing this, she says, made it feel safer for her to play a far riskier character in a very different type of project than those on which she had previously worked. And indeed, there were many challenges for her during filming, including singing and playing the piano on screen for the first time when she performs a song at the end-of-term concert. This is a composition titled In the Garden, which, like the rest of the soundtrack, was written by Perkins' musician brother, Elvis. This song, like the one that plays over the closing credits, has a combination of folk, dark melancholy, and also an undertone of horror. Quote, "She wore her hair around her neck, at the foot of the bed where I've been kept. The sea of white roses where lower things crept in the black night. In the garden, behold, the overgrown weeds, and wildflowers swallowed them both, where they moved with their maker to them. Now they're ghosts in the black night." End quote. In addition to the musical performance and enacting the shockingly violent murders, there was also the bigger challenge of the character arc across which Kat progresses, from vulnerable to quietly disturbing, and then ultimately genuinely unhinged. Wisely, this is played through subtlety and nuance, a far more effective choice than the over-the-top insanity that we often see in films and from performers of, dare I say it, a lesser quality. Her sly smile and quiet delivery of the line when she informs Rose that she has had her chance is loaded with menace, and it's no wonder that the older girl barricades her room with a chest of drawers shortly afterwards. Kat's look of contempt as the sisters say grace is also supremely performed, only capped off by the subsequent moment when she calls one of the nuns a cunt, also beautifully underplayed and all the more disturbing because of it. Shipka has said that there are qualities about Kat that make people uneasy, which is nothing if not an understatement. Going on to say, quote, "She has a sense that she's not alone with herself, and I had to transition into that feeling. The challenge was that we shot everything out of order, so it was a matter of figuring out what part of her arc she was in at any given moment." End quote. I think it's fair to say that she more than met that challenge. The third character, Rose, is played by the English actress Lucy Boynton, who, like hundreds of other hopefuls, submitted a video reel through the casting process. Perkins has described viewing hundreds of such videos until reaching Lucy's, at which point he says he realised he was watching Rose directly before him on the screen. The two had a Skype call, and after hearing the direction and the tone that Perkins wanted to apply to the film, and also the films that inspired him, she was immediately desperate to be signed on and to be a part of the project. Boynton has said that what really impressed her with the script was that it was at once a horror film and not a horror film, and that whilst it has everything you would want in a genre movie, it is also a devastating story. She has also recounted that reading the script was similar to the actual climax of the picture, where you are just left on the brink, and then there's nothing. Osgood Perkins' inspirations for the film included Rosemary's Baby, Don't Look Now, The Shining, Let the Right One In, and Carrie. And Boynton, who has confessed to not being a fan of the genre as she finds horror too scary, watched all of these as part of her preparation. She and Keenan Shipka also deliberately spent as little time together on the set as possible, a strategy that she says helped enormously because instead of getting to know her co-star, who she describes as sweet and light and charismatic, she knew her only as her character, adding to the sense of isolation that permeates the film. Much like Kat, Rose goes on a journey across the narrative, beginning as self-contained and removed from her peer group until the events of the story bring her out of herself. Her reaction when Kat curses at the nun feels incredibly genuine, as is her relief when she discovers that she is in fact not pregnant. All of these elements very much humanize a character who at the start of the film seems very much the stereotypical bad girl, but who, beneath all the bravado, is incredibly vulnerable, as shown in a flashback when her mask quite literally slips after her school portrait is taken. Though we know in advance that Rose is going to be murdered, when the moment comes it is both shocking and hurtful, much like the death of Marion Crane. We have grown to like Rose very much, and to see her stabbed so brutally is a gut-wrenching moment. That the viewer experiences a sudden sensation of grief is of course the director's intent, due both to the nature of the act itself, but also due to the contrast in tone with the rest of the film, which might have its fair share of dread, but, up to the last 15 minutes, has little to no violence. This is something that he explained in a later interview, saying that he wanted to stay away from brutality, and that while there may be events in the film that are challenging to watch, he wanted to make those moments what he called as earned as possible. Quote, "If the experience is one of sadness and grief, then the moments that cause that sadness and grief, the death of a certain character, I want that to be really impactful once, as opposed to wall-to-wall brutality." End quote. The film was shot, appropriately enough, in February 2015, outside Ottawa in Canada, on location at an agricultural college. Conveniently, the college had a dramatically reduced student body, with some 20 or 30 students there at the time of filming, which gave the production a wide range of empty spaces to act as Bramford Academy. This also moved the film away from the Gothic associations of a traditional Victorian building and towards something that Perkins has described as a genuinely scary location, utilitarian, featureless, and in fact the kind of school that is seen all too often on the news following a shooting tragedy. Filming took place in sub-zero temperatures during the coldest recorded February in 4 decades. This proved challenging for all of the cast and crew, but particularly for Emma Roberts, whose character is barely dressed for winter, and who also had to endure stage blood which literally froze on her face. For Keenan Shipka, however, the weather was an asset. She has said that, as an LA native, experiencing a real winter helped her access a greater sense of reality and emotional truth. Ultimately, she said, the cold helped her enormously because it made her want to cry more. The cold blue light of the Canadian winter was also used for the school interiors, with Perkins' regular cinematographer turning off lights and filming largely with natural illumination from the windows. The result is a film that is as dark visually as it is emotionally. Now, if I'm honest, my sole complaint about the movie, and this is a very minor one, is that at points it feels almost a little too dark, and I did find myself, once or twice, wishing they had switched a couple of lamps on. But this is a very small criticism in the wider scheme of things, and I also found myself thinking the same at moments in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu in 2024, so perhaps it's just old age catching up with, or indeed overtaking, my eyesight. As mentioned, the score was composed by Elvis Perkins, and, much like his brother, this was the first feature film he had worked on, something he described as the single most challenging creative endeavour he had ever undertaken. Creating the score, which combines melancholy folk with discordant tones, was, in his own words, a psychologically trying, week-long exercise in tension and dissonance. However, it adds a profound depth of menace and dread to the film's darkly beautiful visuals, and was certainly worth all of the effort. Director Osgood has said that he wasn't happy at all with the final edit until the score and minimalist sound design had all been laid in, and that it was only when all of the elements were added that the film truly came together. In his words, quote, "The lacquer came onto the picture and it felt right." End quote. But whilst it may have felt right creatively, the challenges were far from being over. Premiering under its original title at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2015, it received positive notices, but it struggled to find a distributor and was effectively shelved for nearly a year and a half. It was eventually picked up by A24 and DirecTV Cinema, receiving an initial DirecTV release in February 2017, followed by a brief theatrical run a month later. Wider distribution came via Netflix, after Perkins' second feature had already appeared on the platform, though thankfully before Netflix's notorious and, quite frankly, ridiculous two-screen approach to film production fully kicked in. Even then, though, the critical reception was very mixed. Performances and direction were generally praised, but many felt the overall film and the story lacked cohesion. The AV Club noted that it revealed a surprisingly affecting dimension to satanic horror, but Entertainment Weekly found it frustratingly oblique, and The Observer described it as, quote, cryptic beyond annoyance, end quote. On the other hand, the New York Times was far more complimentary, describing the film as a stealth weapon. It went on to say, quote, slow and seductive and deliberately vague, this deeply unsettling tale of lost parents and troubled daughters exudes atmosphere while withholding facts. Yet the movie is so perfectly acted and gorgeously filmed that we don't mind its coyness. The twanging notes of trepidation make us almost grateful for the leisurely build." End quote. It finished off its review by noting the film's inherent sadness and saying, quote, "The movie doesn't hanker to be understood. It just wants your surrender." End quote. Following the movie's release, Osgood Perkins went on to direct Gretel and Hansel in 2020, Longlegs in 2024, and The Monkey and Keeper both in 2025. The careers of all three leads have also gone from strength to strength. Lucy Boynton appeared in Perkins' 2016 film, I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, as well as the 2017 version of Murder on the Orient Express. She also starred in the 2018 folk horror Apostle, Bohemian Rhapsody, also in 2018, and The Pale Blue Eye in 2020, to name just a few of her projects. In 2025, she played Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in England, in the drama series A Cruel Love, and her latest film, the comedy drama See You When I See You, is due for release in 2026. Emma Roberts starred in the TV series Scream Queens and numerous iterations of the series American Horror Story. She also appeared in multiple film projects, including 2018's Billionaire Boys Club, The Hunt in 2020, and 2024's Space Cadet. As of the time of recording, she currently has 6 projects in pre-production. Keenan Shipka appeared in Feud, Betty and Joan, and then took the title role in the Netflix series The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. This was a show that, in my opinion, had a fantastic first season, with more Easter eggs than I could keep up with, but which suffered from a dramatic change and downshift in tone in seasons 2 and 3. But then again, I wasn't really the target demographic, so what the hell do I know? She also appeared in multiple TV and film projects, including the sci-fi horror The Silence in 2019, the hugely enjoyable time traveller slasher movie Totally Killer in 2023, and then Longlegs, Twisters, and The Last Showgirl, all in 2024. She's currently appearing in the phenomenally popular TV series Industry. I will leave the final words of this section to Osgood Perkins himself, taken from an interview conducted at the time of the film's Toronto premiere. Quote, "What horror movies can be at their best is very stylish, very chancy, very emotional, and they deal with what's hidden. They deal with what we don't know. They deal with what we don't see. And I think as long as you're approaching that from an honest place of, I don't know the answers to everything, and that there's a lot of darkness and elements of darkness in the world we can't quite see past. When you keep that in your mind at all times, and that's how you design the experience of your movie, there's a lot of latitude." End quote. City of the Dead and The Blackcoat's Daughter are both, of course, films set in February, and both explore themes of Satanism, albeit in very different ways. The first is a far more conventional horror story, featuring a coven of Satanists and an almost Lovecraftian atmosphere, while the second is a mournful and deeply affecting meditation on grief and loss, with the presence of a demonic entity which may or may not actually be that. Both films trap their characters in isolated settings, though while the first uses its studio-bound setting as a stylized asset, the second opts for location shooting and natural light. Both, in their own ways, pull the rug from under the viewer at the midway mark, subverting audience expectations with the disposal of a nominal heroine in the first, and the reveal of dual timelines in the second. But whilst in City of the Dead, the horror is external and goodness prevails in the end, the horrors in The Blackcoat's Daughter come from within, and in the final moments, there are no winners at all, only loss. Together, they represent the shift in the vocabulary and style of the genre over the intervening 55-year period. But they also remind us that some things never really change, and that ultimately you should never trust anyone. Ever. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. Just as a reminder, it would mean a great deal to me if you could rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, we are exploring corrosive father-daughter relationships with two films that are rather closer in age than this week's pairing. First up, we have another black and white film from 1960, but this time from France. This is Eyes Without a Face, directed by Georges Franju and starring Pierre Brasseur, Alida Valli, and Edith Scobb. And for those of you of a certain age, I can only apologise if you now have a particular Billy Idol song going around in your head for the rest of the day. Fair warning, you can also safely expect to experience that again next week. We then follow this with Hammer's 1971 adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel The Jewel of Seven Stars. This is Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, directed in the main by Seth Holt, and starring Valerie Leon, Andrew Keir, James Villiers, and Rosalie Crutchley. And if you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. And until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.